The rain had been falling since early morning. Thin drops tapped softly against the windows of the small repair shop near the corner of the old market street. Inside the shop, the air smelled of wood, metal, and old paper. Broken guitars leaned against the walls. Dusty violins rested on shelves. In the back corner stood a faded upright piano with chipped black paint and yellowed keys. A young woman sat quietly in front of it. Her sleeves were rolled up, and her hands carried tiny marks from years of repair work. She carefully pressed one piano key after another, listening closely to every sound. Most people who passed the shop never paid attention to her. To them, she was just another worker fixing old instruments in a forgotten little store. But music had once meant everything to her. Years ago, she dreamed of standing on giant stages in beautiful halls filled with people. She dreamed of creating music that could make strangers feel understood without saying a single word. Back then, she believed life would carry her somewhere special. But life rarely moved the way people expected. The shop owner, an older man with tired eyes and gray hair, walked over carrying a box of broken violin strings. "You've been working on that piano for 3 days," he said with a small smile. "It still sounds heavy," she replied softly while pressing another key. "The middle notes feel weak." The old man laughed quietly. "Most people wouldn't even notice." She looked down at the keyboard. "I would." The old man placed the box on the counter and watched her for a moment. Even after years of knowing her, he still became surprised whenever she touched a piano. There was something different about the way she played. Even simple notes felt emotional. "You should perform somewhere," he said. She gave a small smile but did not answer. People had told her things like that before. It never changed anything. Outside, the rain became stronger. A few customers entered the shop during the afternoon, but business stayed slow. Around sunset, the front door suddenly opened again, and a tall woman wearing a dark blue coat hurried inside while shaking rainwater from her umbrella. "Sorry," the woman said quickly. "I'm looking for someone who repairs audio equipment." The shop owner pointed toward another room. "Second door on the left." Before leaving, the woman suddenly stopped. Music floated softly through the shop. The young repair worker had started playing the piano while waiting for another instrument to dry after cleaning. Her fingers moved gently across the keys. The melody sounded calm at first, but there was sadness hidden inside it. The visitor stood completely still. The small repair shop suddenly felt different. The noise from the street faded away. Even the sound of rain seemed quieter. The woman slowly turned back toward the piano. "You play beautifully," she said after the song ended. The young woman looked embarrassed. "I just play sometimes." "Just sometimes?" the visitor asked with surprise. She shrugged lightly. "Mostly after work." The woman walked closer. "Have you ever performed professionally?" For a second, silence filled the room. "A long time ago," the piano player answered carefully. The visitor introduced herself as one of the organizers for a large city event happening the following weekend. The event would focus on future technology, creativity, and innovation. Big companies, reporters, investors, and important guests were expected to attend. "We need someone to play piano during the opening ceremony," the organizer explained. "Nothing too dramatic. Just something simple and relaxing while guests enter." The words sounded polite, but the meaning underneath them felt clear. Background music. Something people would barely notice. Still, the organizer continued speaking. "Most performers we contacted were unavailable. Then I heard you playing and thought maybe you'd be interested." The young woman lowered her eyes toward the piano keys. Part of her wanted to say no immediately. She had spent years avoiding stages, crowds, and attention. Felt safer that way. Dreams could not break your heart if you stopped chasing them. "How long would the performance be?" she asked quietly. "About 15 minutes. That's all." The organizer nodded. "Like I said, it's mostly atmosphere music." The shop owner looked toward her carefully. He already knew what was happening inside her mind. He could see the hesitation. "You should do it," he said gently. She remained silent. The organizer handed over a small invitation card with the event details printed in silver letters. "If you're interested, call tomorrow," she said before leaving the shop. After the door closed, silence returned again. The young woman stared at the card for a long time. The old man walked closer and leaned against the counter. "You miss it, don't you?" She pretended not to understand. "Miss what?" "Playing for people." Her fingers rested on the piano keys. Finally, she whispered, "Sometimes." The shop owner nodded slowly. "Then maybe this is your chance." That night, she returned to her tiny apartment above an old bakery near the edge of town. The building was old and narrow, with weak lights in the hallway and cracked stairs that creaked loudly at every step. Her apartment contained very little. A small bed sat near the wall beside stacks of music papers and old notebooks. Near the window stood her piano. It was old, scratched, and slightly out of tune in certain places. But it was hers. She sat in front of it without turning on the lights. Outside, rain continued falling across the quiet streets. Her eyes moved toward a framed photograph resting beside the piano. An older man smiled back from the picture. Her father. He had worked long hours in a factory his entire life. His hands were always rough from labor, but every evening he would sit quietly beside her while she practiced piano as a child. "You have something special," he used to tell her. Back then, she believed him. But after his death, everything changed. Money became difficult. Music school became impossible to afford. Slowly, responsibilities replaced dreams. Bills mattered more than songs. Survival mattered more than talent. And little by little, she stopped playing for anyone except herself. She closed her eyes and pressed a single piano key. The sound echoed softly through the apartment. Then another note followed. And another. Soon, music filled the small room. At first, the melody sounded uncertain, almost shy. But as her fingers continued moving, emotions slowly returned. Feelings she had hidden for years began pouring into every note. Pain, loneliness, hope, regret, dreams that never fully disappeared. Hours passed without her noticing. At one point, she suddenly stopped playing and looked down at her trembling hands. Could she really stand on a stage again after all these years? What if people laughed? What if nobody cared? What if she failed? She stood up and walked toward the window. Across the street, the bakery owner downstairs was locking up for the night. Cars moved slowly through puddles beneath glowing streetlights. Everything looked ordinary. And maybe that was the problem. Her whole life had become ordinary. The next morning, she returned to the repair shop feeling exhausted from lack of sleep. The invitation card remained inside her coat pocket the entire day. Around noon, while fixing a broken guitar string, she overheard two customers talking excitedly about the upcoming technology event. "They say people from all over the country are coming," one man said. "There'll probably be famous performers too," the other replied. She quietly looked away. Famous performers. Not people like her. Later that evening, after the customers left, the old shop owner placed a cup of tea beside her work table. "You still thinking about the performance?" She nodded slightly. "What scares you the most?" he asked. She stayed silent for several seconds. "People expecting nothing," she admitted quietly. The old man looked surprised. "Not failure?" he asked. She slowly shook her head. "I think," she whispered, "it hurts more when nobody believes you can do something before you even begin." The shop owner smiled sadly because he understood exactly what she meant. He looked toward the piano in the corner. "Then maybe," he said softly, "it's time to surprise them." That night, she made her decision. Back inside her apartment, she picked up the invitation card one more time. Her hand still felt uncertain, but something deep inside her had already changed. For the first time in years, the fear inside her no longer felt stronger than the dream. She reached for her phone, and slowly, with shaking fingers, she called the number on the card. The next morning felt different. The small apartment was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside the window. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains and landed across the old piano near the wall. The young woman stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee, staring at the instrument without moving. A part of her still could not believe she had agreed to perform. After years of staying invisible, she had suddenly stepped towards something uncertain again. The thought alone made her nervous. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from the event organizer confirming the performance time and location. The message was short and professional. Looking forward to your simple opening performance this Saturday. That one word stayed in her mind. Simple. She knew they did not expect anything memorable from her. To them, she was only filling an empty spot in the schedule. Someone to create soft background music while guests walked around looking at futuristic machines and glowing screens. But somehow that thought no longer made her want to quit. Instead, it bothered her in a different way. She slowly sat at the piano and rested her fingers on the keys. What if simple isn't enough? She whispered to herself. For the next few hours, she played piece after piece, trying to decide what kind of performance to give. She tried soft classical melodies. She tried calm jazz tunes. She even played some popular songs people usually enjoyed during formal events. But every time she stopped, something felt empty. None of it sounded honest. Late in the afternoon, she pulled out an old notebook from beneath her bed. Dust covered the corners. The pages inside were filled with handwritten music from years earlier. Songs nobody had ever heard. Compositions she created during lonely nights after leaving music school. She slowly flipped through the pages, remembering the emotions behind each melody. Some were written during difficult times when she felt lost. Others came from moments when hope still felt alive. Then she paused at one unfinished piece. The paper looked older than the others. At the top corner, in faded handwriting, were two simple words. For tomorrow. Her breathing slowed. She remembered writing it shortly after her father passed away. Back then, she believed the future would somehow become brighter if she kept creating music. But she never finished the composition because life became too heavy afterward. Now, years later, she pressed the first notes carefully. The melody sounded emotional and unfinished at the same time. Soft beginning, deep middle, a powerful rise waiting somewhere ahead. Something inside her suddenly awakened. She began playing faster. New notes entered her mind naturally, almost as if the music had been waiting years to return. Her hands moved across the piano while emotions she buried long ago slowly poured into the room. By evening, she finally stopped. Her heart was racing. For the first time in years, she felt connected to music again. Not as a worker, not as someone repairing instruments for other people, but as herself. Still, fear quickly followed. Would people even understand music like this? The event audience would mostly consist of business people, technology investors, reporters, and important guests. Most of them probably expected safe and ordinary entertainment. Would they even care about emotional piano music from someone nobody knew? That night, sleep became impossible. She kept imagining herself on stage while people ignored her completely. Or worse, what if they laughed? The next day at the repair shop, she tried focusing on work, but her mind stayed trapped inside the upcoming performance. Even simple tasks felt difficult. You're tightening the wrong string, the old shop owner said gently while watching her repair a guitar. She blinked in surprise. Sorry. He smiled knowingly. Still nervous. A little. That means it matters to you. She gave a tired laugh. Or maybe it means I'm making a mistake. The old man placed the guitar aside and sat across from her. When I was younger, he began, I worked security at a music theater in the city. She looked surprised because he rarely spoke about his past. I saw famous performers every week, he continued. Some had perfect technique. Some had expensive training. Some wore beautiful clothes and acted important. He paused for a moment. But do you know which performers people remembered most? She shook her head. The honest ones. She stayed quiet. The audience can feel truth, he said softly. Even if they don't understand music deeply, they can still feel when someone is real. His words stayed in her mind long after the conversation ended. That evening, the event organizers invited all performers and staff to visit the venue for preparation. The event hall stood near the center of the city, surrounded by giant glass buildings glowing with advertisements and digital screens. As she entered the building, she immediately felt small. Workers hurried everywhere carrying equipment. Large machines flashed colorful lights. Technicians tested speakers while giant screens displayed futuristic animations across the walls. Everything looked expensive, modern, perfect. She quietly followed one of the assistants toward the stage area. In the middle of the massive hall stood a beautiful grand piano beneath bright white lights. Her footsteps slowed. She had not touched a piano like this in years. One organizer walked over holding a clipboard. He smiled politely but distractedly. "Oh good, you made it," he said quickly. "Your performance is right at the beginning before the main presentations start." She nodded silently. The man continued speaking while checking notes. "Nothing too loud or emotional, okay? We want guests to relax while entering." She forced a small smile. Nearby, two event workers were arranging chairs while speaking quietly to each other. "Is she the pianist?" "I think so. She seems nervous." "Well, it's only background music anyway." They laughed softly before walking away. The words hit harder than she expected. For a moment, embarrassment burned through her chest. She suddenly became aware of her simple clothes, her quiet voice, her ordinary appearance among all these polished professionals. She almost turned around and left. But then her eyes landed on the piano again. Something pulled her toward it. She slowly sat down on the bench while workers continued moving around the hall. Nobody paid much attention to her. Her fingers touched the keys carefully. The sound was rich and warm, far more beautiful than the old piano in her apartment. She closed her eyes and began playing part of For Tomorrow. At first, the melody blended softly into the noise around the hall. But little by little, conversations started fading. One technician stopped walking. A woman arranging decorations slowly looked toward the stage. Even the workers who had mocked her earlier turned back in surprise. The music only lasted about 1 minute before she stopped suddenly, embarrassed by the attention. Silence filled the room for a second. Then someone quietly whispered, "Wow!" She stood up quickly. "I was just testing the sound," she explained nervously. But something had already changed. People were looking at her differently now. Not like background decoration. Not completely, anyway. Later, while leaving the hall, she overheard two staff members talking again. "She's actually really good." Yeah. That didn't sound simple at all. For the first time since accepting the performance, a tiny bit of confidence appeared inside her. But confidence alone could not erase fear. The closer the event came, the harder it became to calm her thoughts. The night before the performance, heavy clouds covered the city again. Rain tapped softly against her apartment window while she sat at the piano practicing the same composition over and over. Her fingers ached. Her shoulders felt tense. Still, she continued. At one point, she suddenly made a mistake and slammed the piano key harder than intended. Frustration rushed through her chest. "What am I doing?" she whispered angrily. She stood up and walked away from the piano. Maybe the organizers were right. Maybe she should simply play something safe and forget all these emotional ideas. After all, who was she trying to impress? But as she looked around the apartment, her eyes stopped at the old photograph beside the piano again. Her father's smile. Simple, tired, hopeful. A memory suddenly returned to her from childhood. She remembered being terrified before a small school performance many years earlier. Back then, she wanted to quit moments before walking on stage. Her father had crouched beside her and quietly said something she never forgot. "People don't remember perfect notes," he told her. "They remember how music made them feel." Tears slowly filled her eyes now. For years, she had hidden from the world because she feared disappointment. She convinced herself staying invisible was safer than risking failure. But deep down, music was still part of who she was. And maybe this performance was not really about success or attention. Maybe it was about finally stopping herself from running away. She walked back to the piano and sat down once more. Then she began playing again. This time, the music sounded stronger. Not because the fear disappeared, but because she decided fear would no longer control her. The morning of the event arrived faster than she expected. She barely slept the entire night. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the stage, the crowd, and the sound of silence after her performance. Her thoughts moved endlessly between fear and excitement until sunrise finally filled the apartment with pale golden light. For several minutes, she remained sitting on the edge of her bed without moving. Today was the day. Outside, the city already felt alive. Cars moved through the streets below. People hurried toward work carrying coffee cups and umbrellas. The world looked normal, but inside her chest everything felt different. She walked slowly toward the piano near the window. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, but she did not play. Instead, she stared at the old photograph beside the piano again. Her father's smile somehow made the room feel calmer. "I'm trying," she whispered softly. After getting ready, she wore the only formal black dress she owned. It was simple and slightly old-fashioned, but clean and elegant enough for the event. She tied her hair back neatly and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She still looked ordinary, not like famous performers from magazines or television. Just a quiet woman from a repair shop. For a second, insecurity returned again. But then she remembered something the old shop owner once told her. The audience remembers honesty. She took a slow breath, picked up her music notebook, and left the apartment. The city center looked completely different by afternoon. Giant digital billboards flashed colorful advertisements above crowded streets. Expensive cars lined the roads near the event hall. Security guards stood outside the entrance while reporters carried cameras through the crowd. The technology event had become much larger than she imagined. As she entered the building, loud music echoed through the hall while workers rushed between booths displaying futuristic inventions. Some companies showed robotic machines. Others presented glowing touchscreens, virtual reality equipment, and advanced designs for the future. Everything around her screamed innovation. She suddenly wondered whether her emotional piano music even belonged there. An assistant quickly approached her near the entrance. "You're the pianist, right?" he asked while checking a list. She nodded quietly. "Good. Opening starts in 30 minutes. Follow me." He guided her backstage through long hallways filled with cables, equipment, and busy staff members speaking into headsets. Nobody paid much attention to her. Most workers were focused on schedules, lighting, and important guests arriving soon. Near the stage entrance, she finally saw the grand piano waiting beneath bright white lights. Her stomach tightened instantly. The room beyond the curtains was enormous. Hundreds of chairs filled the hall. Giant screens stretched across the walls displaying futuristic graphics and moving animations. Elegant guests slowly entered while soft conversations blended together into constant noise. She had never performed for a crowd like this before. The assistant handed her a small microphone pack. "You won't need to speak," he explained quickly. "Just begin once the announcer introduces you." She nodded again, barely hearing him. Her hands felt cold. Nearby, two performers from another presentation were talking while adjusting their outfits. One of them glanced toward her briefly. "She's opening the event?" he whispered quietly. "I guess so," the other replied with a shrug. "She looks terrified." They were not wrong. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. A few minutes later, the main organizer approached her holding a tablet. "We're starting soon," he said. "Remember, calm and simple music while people settle in." Again that word, simple. She forced a polite smile, but deep inside, another thought had already formed. No, not this time. The organizer walked away before noticing the change in her expression. Behind the curtains, the opening announcements began. Bright lights flashed across the stage while the audience slowly took their seats. She waited alone beside the piano entrance. The noise from the crowd sounded distant now, almost unreal. Her breathing became shallow. Suddenly, all the fear she had pushed aside over the past week returned at once. What if she forgot the notes? What if her hands shook too badly? What if nobody cared? Her mind filled with worst-case scenarios so quickly that she almost stepped away from the stage entirely. Then someone touched her shoulder gently. She turned in surprise. It was the old shop owner. "You came?" she asked softly. "Of course," he said with a warm smile. "Did you really think I'd miss this?" Emotion filled her chest unexpectedly. The old man looked toward the stage entrance. "Nervous?" She laughed weakly. "Very." He nodded calmly. "That means your heart is awake." She looked down at her shaking hands. "I don't know if I can do this." The old man stayed quiet for a second before answering. "When people are scared," he said softly, "they usually focus on themselves. They think about mistakes, embarrassment, failure." He pointed gently toward the audience beyond the curtains. "But music was never meant to be about you alone." She listened carefully. "Play for the people out there who feel invisible," he continued. "Play for the people carrying pain nobody notices. Play for the people who stopped believing in themselves." He smiled gently. And suddenly, fear won't feel so important anymore. Before she could respond, the announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "And now, to begin tonight's event, please welcome our opening pianist." Applause followed politely, not excited, not emotional, just polite. The old shop owner gave her one final nod. "Go remind them what real music feels like." Then she walked toward the stage. The bright lights hit her eyes immediately. For one terrifying second, the massive crowd blurred together into a sea of unfamiliar faces. Business leaders, investors, reporters, wealthy guests, people holding phones and chatting quietly while waiting for the main presentations to begin. Most barely looked at her. Some continued conversations while she crossed the stage. Others glanced toward the piano with mild curiosity before returning attention to their screens. Exactly as expected. Background music. Nothing more. She sat at the piano bench slowly. The hall suddenly felt enormous. Her hands hovered above the keys while silence stretched painfully around her. She could hear faint laughter from tables near the back. Glasses clinked softly. A few people moved through aisles searching for seats. Nobody expected anything special. For a brief second, doubt almost defeated her again. Maybe she should just play something safe. Simple. Forgettable. Easy. Then her eyes moved across the crowd once more. And suddenly, she noticed something. Not everyone looked distracted. Near the far side of the hall, a cleaning worker had paused beside a doorway to watch quietly. An older woman in the audience sat alone staring toward the stage with tired eyes. A young waiter carrying drinks slowed his steps slightly, curious about the silence before the music began. Regular people. Ordinary people. People who probably understood struggle more than the wealthy guests ever could. Something shifted inside her. She took one slow breath. Then she pressed the first key. The sound floated gently through the hall. Soft, delicate, almost fragile. At first, nobody reacted. The melody began quietly, like a whisper hidden beneath noise and conversation. Her fingers moved carefully across the piano while the opening notes carried sadness and warmth together. Then the second part arrived. The music deepened. Emotion slowly entered every note, growing stronger with each passing moment. The melody no longer sounded like background entertainment. It sounded personal, human, real. One by one, conversations around the hall began fading. People slowly turned toward the stage. A man checking his phone lowered it halfway. Two reporters stopped speaking to each other. Even the waiters carrying trays began moving more quietly. The melody continued building. Her fear slowly disappeared beneath the music itself. Years of loneliness, lost dreams, silent pain, and hidden hope poured into every note she played. The giant screens behind her displayed futuristic technology and glowing digital graphics, but somehow the simple sound of piano became stronger than all of it. The room was changing, and everyone could feel it. Near the front row, one investor leaned toward another person and whispered, "Who is she?" Nobody seemed to know, but suddenly, everyone wanted to. The melody rose higher, powerful now, emotional enough to make the entire hall completely still. Some audience members stared at the stage with wide eyes. Others looked strangely emotional without understanding why. The music carried something deeper than performance. It carried truth. Backstage, several organizers exchanged shocked looks. "This wasn't rehearsal music," one whispered. "No," another answered quietly. "This is something else." Meanwhile, she continued playing without noticing any of them. For the first time in years, she stopped worrying about judgment, stopped worrying about expectations, stopped trying to make herself smaller for other people's comfort. The piano no longer felt like an instrument. It felt like a voice finally speaking after years of silence. And the entire hall was finally listening. The hall remained completely silent. Not the polite silence people give during formal events. This silence felt different, heavy, emotional. The kind of silence that only happens when people forget everything around them for a moment. Her fingers continued moving across the piano keys, while the melody filled every corner of the massive room. The giant digital screens behind her still flashed futuristic images, but nobody seemed interested in technology anymore. All eyes were on her. Even she could hardly believe what was happening. Only minutes earlier, most people in the audience had ignored her existence. Now hundreds of strangers sat frozen in their seats, listening as if the music had reached somewhere deep inside them. The melody softened again. Gentle notes floated through the air like memories returning after many years. Her hands no longer shook. Fear had disappeared completely. For the first time in a very long time, she felt free. As she played, old memories slowly rose inside her mind. She remembered sitting beside her father near the tiny radio in their old apartment when she was a child. The building was always noisy. Pipes rattled inside the walls. Neighbors argued through thin doors. Money was always tight. But every evening, after returning exhausted from factory work, her father still asked her to play piano for him. Even when he was tired, even when life felt difficult. He used to sit quietly with his eyes closed while listening to her practice simple songs on an old keyboard someone had thrown away years earlier. "You know what makes music powerful?" he once asked her during those days. She had been only 12 years old. "The notes?" she guessed. He smiled and shook his head. "The feeling behind the notes." At the time, she barely understood what he meant. But now, sitting on this giant stage years later, she finally understood completely. Music was never about being perfect. It was about making people feel less alone. The melody grew stronger again. Deep emotions flowed through every part of the composition she had hidden for years. Pain from losing her father. Loneliness from abandoned dreams. The quiet sadness of becoming invisible in a world too busy to notice ordinary people. All of it lived inside the music now. Near the middle rows, a woman quietly wiped tears from her eyes. A young man recording the performance on his phone slowly lowered it because he became too emotional to keep filming steadily. Even several event workers backstage stood completely still, listening. One organizer whispered softly, "Why does this feel so personal?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew the full story behind the music. Not yet. Back near the entrance of the hall, the cleaning worker who had paused earlier still stood watching. He leaned quietly against the wall, completely forgetting about the trash cart beside him. The music reminded him of his late wife. Near the front row, an older businessman stared silently toward the stage. He had attended hundreds of expensive events over the years. Most performances blurred together in his memory after a few days. But this felt different. This performance felt human. And maybe that was why nobody could look away. Meanwhile, she continued playing as if the piano itself had become part of her heartbeat. The unfinished composition from years ago no longer felt unfinished anymore. Every missing piece had finally found its place. The melody slowly climbed toward its emotional peak. Powerful notes echoed through the hall while emotions spread across the audience like a wave. Some people closed their eyes while listening. Others stared at her with disbelief. How could someone they almost ignored become the most unforgettable part of the entire event? Backstage, the organizers looked increasingly nervous. One of them checked the schedule repeatedly. "She's already gone longer than planned," he whispered. Another organizer shook her head slowly. "Don't stop her." "But the next presentation. Look at the audience." Everyone turned toward the hall. Nobody was checking phones anymore. Nobody was talking. Nobody cared about the schedule. For the first time since the event started, the entire audience was fully connected to one single moment. And it had nothing to do with technology. One reporter quietly spoke into his microphone while recording. "This unknown pianist has completely transformed the atmosphere here tonight," he whispered. Nearby, another journalist quickly uploaded a short video clip online with the caption, "Who is this performer?" Within minutes, notifications started exploding across social media. People watching the clips online became curious immediately. The emotional piano performance felt strangely powerful even through tiny phone screens. Comments flooded in rapidly. "This gave me chills. Why am I emotional listening to this? She deserves a bigger stage." Back inside the hall, she still had no idea any of this was happening. She was lost inside the music itself. As the composition entered its final section, her thoughts drifted toward the last conversation she ever had with her father. It happened shortly before his health became worse. That evening, she had come home frustrated after failing an important music competition. She remembered crying in the kitchen while complaining that talented people only succeeded if they had money, connections, or perfect opportunities. Her father listened quietly before speaking. "Maybe," he said softly, "but real talent doesn't disappear just because life becomes difficult." At the time, she did not believe him. Years passed after his death, and she slowly convinced herself those dreams were over forever. Yet somehow here she was now, still playing, still feeling, still hoping. The final section of the song became softer again. The powerful notes faded into gentle emotion, almost like the music itself was breathing slowly after releasing years of hidden pain. The audience remained completely still. No coughing, no whispers, only piano. One final memory entered her mind. She remembered sitting alone in her apartment years earlier after giving up music school. Bills covered the table. Her future felt uncertain. She had placed both hands on the piano and promised herself she would stop dreaming about stages forever because disappointment hurt too much. That promise nearly became permanent, until one unexpected invitation changed everything. Simple background music. That was all they asked for. But sitting here now, she realized something important. People often ask for simple things because they are afraid of emotion, afraid of truth, afraid of being moved deeply. Yet deep down, that was exactly what people needed most. Her fingers touched the final series of notes. Slow, gentle, honest. The last chord echoed through the hall and slowly disappeared into silence. For one long second, nobody moved. The room almost felt frozen in time. She lowered her hands carefully from the piano keys while her breathing remained uneven from emotion. Then it happened. Applause exploded across the hall. Not polite applause, not formal applause, real applause. People rose from their seats almost instantly. Cheers filled the room while hundreds of hands clapped loudly enough to shake the entire hall. Some audience members even shouted. The sound overwhelmed her completely. Her eyes widened in shock. She had imagined so many endings to this night. Failure, embarrassment, silence. But never this. The standing ovation continued growing louder. Several people near the front rows were visibly emotional. Reporters rushed closer to the stage while cameras flashed brightly around the room. Backstage workers stared in disbelief. One organizer laughed nervously while shaking his head. "We almost treated her like elevator music." Another replied quietly, "Big mistake." Meanwhile, she remained seated at the piano, unable to fully process what was happening around her. Her chest felt tight with emotion. For years, she believed the world no longer cared about what she had inside her. But tonight proved something different. People did care. Maybe not about perfection. Maybe not about fame. But they cared about truth. And somehow, through music, she had finally shared her truth with complete strangers. Near the back of the hall, the old shop owner stood quietly with tears in his eyes. He smiled proudly while the crowd continued applauding. Because deep down, he already knew this moment would change her life forever. The applause refused to end. She sat frozen at the piano while hundreds of people remained standing around the hall. The sound echoed through the massive building like a wave that kept returning stronger each time. For a few seconds, she honestly thought she might cry. Not because of fame, not because of attention, but because after years of feeling invisible, people were finally listening. She slowly stood from the piano bench while the audience continued clapping loudly. Bright camera flashes filled the room. Some guests even lifted their phones higher to record her reaction. She did not know what to do, so she simply placed one hand over her heart and gave a small emotional smile. That simple gesture somehow made the audience cheer even louder. Backstage, workers rushed around nervously because the event schedule had completely fallen apart. But strangely, nobody seemed upset about it anymore. The performance had become the event itself. As she walked away from the stage, several people immediately surrounded her near the curtain entrance. "That was incredible. I've never heard anything like that before. Was that your original composition?" Questions came from every direction. She answered quietly, still overwhelmed. "Yes, I wrote it years ago." A reporter quickly stepped forward with a microphone. What inspired the song? For a moment, she did not know how to answer. How could she explain years of grief, hope, loneliness, and hidden dreams in one short sentence? Finally, she said softly, "Life." The reporter looked surprised by the simplicity of the answer. But deep down, it was the truth. Before more questions could follow, one of the organizers guided her away from the crowd toward a quieter hallway backstage. "You need a moment," the organizer said kindly. She nodded thankfully. The hallway felt much calmer compared to the loud excitement outside. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes briefly while trying to slow her breathing. Her hands still trembled slightly from emotion. Then she heard footsteps approaching. She opened her eyes and saw a man in his late 50s walking toward her. He wore a dark gray suit and carried himself with quiet confidence. Unlike the others, he did not rush forward excitedly. He simply stopped a few feet away and smiled gently. "That performance was honest," he said. The words caught her attention immediately because they felt different from the usual compliments. "Thank you," she replied softly. The man introduced himself as a music producer who had spent decades working with singers, composers, and orchestras around the world. Even though she recognized the company name he mentioned, she tried not to react too strongly. People in music knew that name very well. He looked at her carefully for a moment before speaking again. "How long have you been hiding?" The question surprised her. "I'm sorry. You don't play like someone inexperienced," he explained calmly. "You play like someone who stopped believing they deserved to be heard." His words hit painfully close to the truth. She looked away for a second. "I used to study music," she admitted quietly. "But life changed." The producer nodded slowly as if he already expected that answer. "Life changes for everyone," he said. "But talent like yours doesn't disappear." She gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. "I think you're overestimating me." "No," he replied firmly. "Actually, I think the world has been underestimating you." Silence filled the hallway for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. "If you're willing," he said, "I'd like to hear more of your original music." She stared at the card in disbelief. Part of her wanted to believe this moment was real. Another part feared it would disappear the second she looked away. Before she could answer, loud voices suddenly echoed from the main hall again. More people were searching for her. The producer smiled lightly. "Looks like tonight changed things." Then he walked away calmly, leaving her standing there holding the card with shaking fingers. A few minutes later, she finally found the old shop owner near the backstage entrance. The second he saw her expression, he laughed warmly. "You survived." She laughed too, though tears nearly appeared in her eyes again. "I don't understand what just happened," she admitted. The old man smiled proudly. "People felt something real. That doesn't happen often anymore." As they spoke, several younger event workers nearby kept glancing toward her excitedly. One finally walked over nervously. "Can I ask something?" he said. She nodded politely. How long did it take you to become that good? She paused before answering. Years, she said honestly. And also pain. The worker looked confused for a second, but the old shop owner quietly understood exactly what she meant. Later that night, after the event finally ended, she stepped outside the building into the cool evening air. Rain had stopped completely. The streets glowed beneath city lights, while groups of guests slowly left the venue talking excitedly about the performance. Some people even recognized her as she walked by. That's the pianist. She was amazing. Did you record the ending? The attention still felt unreal. Only 2 days earlier, nobody at the event even expected her performance to matter. Now strangers were discussing her like she belonged there all along. As she stood near the sidewalk waiting for a taxi, her phone suddenly began vibrating non-stop inside her coat pocket. Messages, notifications, missed calls. She looked down in confusion. Social media clips of the performance had spread far beyond the event hall. Videos recorded by audience members were already receiving thousands of views online. Every time she refreshed the screen, the numbers grew larger. Comments filled every video. Her music feels alive. I haven't cried listening to piano in years. Why have we never heard of her before? One comment made her stop scrolling completely. This reminds me that ordinary people carry extraordinary stories. She stared at those words silently, because that was exactly how she had felt her entire life. Ordinary on the outside, invisible most of the time, yet carrying emotions and dreams nobody ever truly saw. A taxi finally arrived. During the drive home, the city lights blurred softly outside the window while she sat quietly holding the producer's business card. Everything felt uncertain now. Exciting, terrifying, possible. When she finally reached her apartment building, she climbed the narrow stairs slowly, still emotionally exhausted from the night. The moment she entered her apartment, silence surrounded her again. The small room looked exactly the same as before. The old piano near the window, the stacks of papers, the cracked walls. Yet somehow nothing felt the same anymore. She walked toward the piano and sat down carefully. For several minutes, she simply stared at the keys without touching them. Then tears finally came. Quiet tears. Not from sadness. Not fully from happiness either. Mostly from relief. Relief that she had not given up completely. Relief that her father had been right all those years ago. Real talent does not disappear just because life becomes difficult. Her eyes moved toward the old photograph beside the piano. You saw that, didn't you? She whispered emotionally. Outside, the city remained alive with noise and movement. But inside the apartment, the moment felt peaceful. Then her phone rang again. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello. A familiar voice spoke immediately. It was the producer. I hope I'm not calling too late, he said politely. No, it's okay. I'll keep this simple, he continued. I believe your music deserves a much larger audience. Her heartbeat instantly quickened again. I don't know if I'm ready for something like that, she admitted honestly. That's normal, he replied. Most real artists aren't ready when life suddenly finds them. She smiled faintly at the strange truth behind those words. The producer continued, I'd like to invite you to a private recording session next week. No pressure. No contracts yet. Just music. She stayed silent for several seconds. A week ago, opportunities like this belonged to other people. Now one was sitting directly in front of her. Finally, she answered softly. Okay. After the call ended, she leaned back slowly against the piano bench and looked around the tiny apartment once more. For years, this room had witnessed disappointment, loneliness, and forgotten dreams. Tonight, for the first time, it also witnessed possibility. Outside the window, the city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. And somewhere beyond those lights, a future she never imagined was quietly beginning to open. The days after the performance passed like a dream she could barely understand. Everything changed so quickly that sometimes she woke up in the middle of the night wondering if it had all been imagined. But every morning, reality reminded her otherwise. Her phone stayed filled with messages. Videos of the performance continued spreading online. Millions of people watched short clips from the event, sharing emotional reactions in the comments. Some viewers said the music helped them through difficult moments. Others admitted they cried without understanding why. Complete strangers from different parts of the world connected through the same melody she once believed nobody would care about. Even walking through the city became different. A few people recognized her from the videos now. Some politely waved. Others asked for pictures or thanked her for the performance. The attention still felt uncomfortable sometimes. But deep down, she understood something important. People were not connecting to perfection. They were connecting to honesty. 1 week after the event, she entered the recording studio for the first time. The building stood in a quieter part of the city, far away from crowded streets and flashing advertisements. Inside, everything looked calm and professional. Large speakers lined the walls. Instruments rested neatly inside glass rooms. Soft lights reflected across polished floors. She suddenly felt nervous again. The producer greeted her warmly near the entrance. "You made it," he said with a smile. She laughed softly. "I almost turned around 3 times before coming inside." "That's normal," he replied. "Fear usually shows up right before important moments." He guided her through the studio while explaining how the recording process would work. Several musicians and sound engineers greeted her politely, but unlike many people at the technology event, nobody treated her like a temporary background performer. They listened carefully when she spoke. That alone felt strange. Inside the main recording room stood another beautiful grand piano beneath soft white lights. She slowly walked toward it. Her reflection stared back at her from the piano's polished surface. For a second, she remembered the tiny repair shop where all of this began. The old upright piano with chipped paint. The quiet afternoons fixing broken strings while believing her dreams were over forever. Life could change so suddenly. The producer placed a notebook on the piano. "We'd like to hear more original compositions," he explained. "Not what people expect. What feels real to you." Those words stayed in her mind, because for years, she spent most of her life hiding the real parts of herself. Now people were finally asking to hear them. The recording session began quietly. At first, her nerves made simple notes feel difficult. She worried about mistakes again, worried about disappointing everyone after the success of the event. But gradually, the same thing that happened on stage returned once more. The moment emotion became stronger than fear, the music changed completely. Hours passed quickly. The people inside the studio listened carefully while she played old compositions hidden inside dusty notebooks for years. Some songs sounded hopeful. Others carried sadness and quiet loneliness. Every melody told pieces of her story without using words. At one point, one of the sound engineers removed his headphones slowly. "That doesn't sound rehearsed," he said quietly. She looked embarrassed. "Is that bad?" "No," he answered honestly. "It sounds alive." The producer smiled from across the room because that was exactly what he hoped people would hear. Over the next few months, everything continued growing bigger. Her recordings reached online music platforms. Small interviews turned into larger ones. Invitations arrived from different cities asking her to perform live concerts and creative events. But despite all the attention, some things about her never changed. She still visited the old repair shop regularly. The old shop owner always pretended not to care about her growing success, though his proud smile gave him away every time. One afternoon, she entered the shop wearing sunglasses and a hoodie, hoping nobody outside would recognize her. The old man laughed immediately. "You know, famous people usually buy expensive disguises." She smiled while helping organize instruments behind the counter. "I still don't feel famous." "That's probably why people trust your music," he replied. While cleaning shelves together, she suddenly noticed a teenage boy standing nervously near the shop entrance holding a worn guitar case. The boy looked hesitant. "Can I help you?" she asked kindly. The teenager looked shocked when he realized who she was. I just wanted to say thank you," he said quietly. She looked confused. The boy lowered his eyes. I stopped playing music for almost a year because people kept saying I wasn't good enough. He swallowed nervously. Then I saw your performance online. Silence filled the small shop for a moment. You started playing again? She asked softly. The boy nodded. Emotion touched her deeply because she understood exactly how hopeless people could feel when their dreams were constantly ignored. Before leaving, the teenager asked one final question. How did you keep believing in yourself? She almost laughed at the irony, because the truth was, she had stopped believing in herself many times. But after thinking for a moment, she answered honestly. I didn't always believe in myself, she admitted. Sometimes I just kept going long enough for hope to return. The boy smiled quietly before leaving the shop. After the door closed, the old shop owner looked toward her proudly. You see, he said softly, your music was never only about music. Months later, another invitation arrived. The same technology event wanted her to return for their next annual opening ceremony. This time, however, everything felt completely different. Instead of being treated like background entertainment, her name appeared across advertisements, digital posters, and online promotions as the main featured performer. The organizers who once asked for simple background music now proudly described her as the emotional heart of the event. When she first saw the poster, she honestly did not know whether to laugh or cry. The night of the new event arrived faster than expected. As her car approached the venue, crowds already waited outside the entrance. Reporters stood near cameras while fans gathered behind barriers hoping to see her arrive. The giant hall looked even larger than before. But this time, something felt calmer inside her. Not because fear disappeared completely. Fear still existed. But now she understood that fear did not mean weakness. It simply meant something mattered deeply. Backstage, several staff members greeted her warmly. One organizer shook his head while smiling. I still can't believe we almost wasted your talent as background music. She laughed softly. Honestly, I almost wasted it too. Those words stayed with him after she walked away. Because sometimes the greatest tragedy is not when the world ignores talent. It is when talented people begin believing they deserve to stay invisible. A few minutes before the performance, she stood alone near the stage entrance. The same bright lights waited beyond the curtains. The same giant crowd filled the hall. Yet this moment felt strangely emotional because she remembered exactly how terrified she felt the first time she stood here. Back then, she believed nobody expected anything from her. Tonight, people had arrived early just to hear her play. She quietly looked upward for a second. In her mind, she imagined her father sitting somewhere nearby listening like he used to years ago after long factory shifts. That thought made her smile gently. Then the announcer's voice echoed through the hall. Please welcome tonight's featured performer. Thunderous applause erupted instantly. She stepped onto the stage slowly while lights surrounded her from every direction. Thousands of faces looked toward her now with excitement instead of indifference. But strangely, the moment that touched her most happened near the front row. The cleaning worker from the previous year's event was sitting there wearing a neat suit. When their eyes met briefly, he smiled proudly and placed one hand over his heart. She recognized him immediately, and somehow that small moment mattered more than the cameras or applause, because it reminded her who she was really playing for. Ordinary people. People carrying invisible pain. People trying to survive difficult lives while quietly holding on to forgotten dreams. She sat at the piano bench and rested her fingers on the keys. The massive hall slowly became silent. Then, before beginning, she spoke softly into the microphone for the first time. Sometimes people ask for something simple because they don't expect anything extraordinary, she said gently. But hidden inside ordinary lives are stories, feelings, and dreams stronger than anyone realizes. The audience listened carefully. She smiled faintly. And sometimes, all those dreams need is one chance. Then she began to play. And this time, the music no longer sounded like someone trying to prove they mattered. It sounded like someone who finally understood they always did.